Okay, so for these questions, you're kind of looking at Scrooge. Yeah. Scrooge's character before and after. So this, I don't know what block we started this in. So before, we saw that Scrooge was selfish, and so what would be evidence of that? He raised the price of corn, which the buyers in the film pointed out that if you do that, it's going to hurt the poor, and Scrooge didn't care. He's like, it's business. That's his thing. It's business. Let's add that. It's business. This keyboard is weird. It's business, which is kind of like a rationalization. Rationalizations are when we make excuses for things we know that are wrong. So the fact that he's making rationalizations, if you think to Unit 3, that's where we talked about conscience. So the conscience is a judgment of reason by which we can know the moral quality of an act we are going to perform, are performing, or have performed. I'll fix those. So the fact that he's kind of making this rationalization that it's just business, he's trying to kind of excuse his guilt-worthiness for so that's the fact that he's making these rationalizations indicates that he knows what he's doing is wrong. So you can bring in your understanding of conscience there if you wanted to. So you could also bring in the vocabulary word. Remember we talked about vincible ignorance versus invincible ignorance? Vincible ignorance can be overcome. And there are frequent examples in the film where Scrooge doesn't want to face the truth. And truth, let's put that in there. Truth was in Unit 1, and what is truth? The definition of truth is when what we know in our intellect is in accord with reality. So Scrooge makes these rationalizations up to try to, he knows deep down in his conscience that what he's doing is wrong. So he has to rationalize his bad behavior. So he's selfish. Other examples of his selfishness, he refuses to give to philanthropy, and with raising the price of corn, so this would be a sin of omission. Because he obviously can donate to charity, but he doesn't. And actually, raising the price of corn, another vocab word you could bring in there is social sin. Because social sin is when our personal sin becomes part of the social structure. What happened? I must have hit a keyboard shortcut I didn't know I was hitting. Where was I? Oh, there it is. Did this pause? No, that's still going. Okay, so when personal sin becomes part of the social structures of society, and an example of that, it would be like in law or business practices. So Scrooge's unjust business practices or an example of like social sin. Sorry, can't type. Yeah. Let's see. Another example, he wouldn't buy coal to heat the office. And I think we did this with Block D. He's also very lonely and isolated. An example of that is he wouldn't go to Christmas supper with his nephew. And when we look at Scrooge's character change, that's where you can bring in, oops. What was that? Oh, yeah, he wasn't there when Marley was dying. He lives alone. And when you look at Scrooge's character, he's, another thing we can say about him before, is he's deeply unhappy. He doesn't even seem to really know it, though. And this gets to when we talked in Unit 2 about human nature. And that was also where we talked about the levels of happiness. We can compare what we know about human nature with Scrooge. So, and that's also where you could just bring in the idea of morality, because the purpose of the moral life is happiness. And so, so that's where also the hierarchy of goods comes into play. So what is a good? A good is something that's conducive to well-being, and it's fitting to our nature. So an example of a good would be like meat is good for cats. And for human beings, because of the type of creatures we are, since we're both a body and a rational soul, we have free will, we can make choices. So we have, let's see, so humans are hylomorphic. So hylomorphic means we're a soul plus a body, right? And they're integrated. They're not meant to be separate. That's why death is bad, by the way, because your soul is separated from your body, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. So your soul has these powers, the power of intellect and free will. And then you have your body, which is where like your passions and appetites, come from. And passions, remember here, we just mean our emotions. So we don't mean passion like passion like love, like being passionate about a sport, or like passion like physical love. We mean like that's just an old-timey word for emotions. So so because we have free will, we can choose higher goods, and it's because we have an intellect that we can know what's good. So what we see in Scrooge, in the way he starts off in the beginning of the film, what good does Scrooge value? Money, right? So for Scrooge, his highest good is money. And remember back when we talked about, so the hierarchy of goods, let's define that. And you could stop me at any time if you want to add something. So the hierarchy of goods. So a hierarchy is just a ranked order. So a hierarchy of goods ranks goods from lowest to highest. And highest. And remember, there are relative goods. So relative goods are a means to an end. So an example of that would actually be money. Money. Why do we need money to like buy other things. But what Scrooge has done is, go ahead.
When you say, like with a good conducted to well-being,
Mm-hmm.
is it good for cats?
So it's conducive to our well-being. So an example of a good is meat is like a good for cats. So, because like cats can't be vegetarian. So, like, you couldn't say, what that points out is there's an objective aspect of what's good for a given thing. So, like, you couldn't just decide that, well, I think it's wrong to kill animals, so I'm going to make my cat a vegetarian. And it's the same thing for morality. You can't just decide that, like, yeah, it's good to rape and murder. I think that's okay, because there are people who think that. There are people who actually find great pleasure in raping and murdering people. They're psychopaths. But that kind of, that gets to because there's both subject. Let's add that. So let me add that there. So this would be the objective aspect of morality, because given a thing's nature, there's certain things that are objectively good for it, but there's also a subjective aspect. So one thing that's good for human beings is to be in relationship, right? But all of us, like, you can't be like Scrooge and be a person who's not in relationship with others and be happy. But each one of us is going to choose different types of relationships, right? Some of us might get married. Some of us, like the sisters, they live in community, like they don't get married and have kids. Some people just live the single life but have lots of friends. So objectively, humans have to be in relationship. You can't be a properly functioning human being and not be in relationship with others. But the way we live out that good is going to be different. So there's both subjective and objective aspects. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and you don't have to get too detailed into that. You just, for this, you just want to use the words, like you could define them, but use them insofar as they relate to the film. You could mention that part of Scrooge's problem is that he like, one of the main reasons he's unhappy is he's not living like a fully human life, right? Yeah. I linked it to the slides, and I'll also put a link to it on Schoology. Was there another question? Yeah.
So on the slide it says questions 1, 2, and 4.
Mm-hmm.
You also have to do 3 and 5 as well.
No. Well, you won't. You'll get there's 5 options, and you'll get 2, and you'll pick 1. So you won't know which one you'll get till the day of the final, or tomorrow. We're going to review them. Yeah. So we'll get to that. Hang on. Okay. So, sorry. So relative goods are means to an end. You have absolute goods that are good in themselves. So, an example of an absolute good would be like a flourishing apple tree. Or like persons are absolute goods. Or like, because why do we do everything we do? We're striving for some end. And so, like, why do I go to work? Because I need the money. Well, why do I need the money? Because I want to support my family. The absolute good is my family, but there's all these other goods that I have to pursue along that way. So, part of Scrooge's problem is he's treating money as an absolute good, but it's not. And remember also, St. Thomas Aquinas said that there are apparent goods. I spell that wrong every time. Apparent goods are things that are truly good, but they're not the highest good. So the problem with if we strive for the apparent goods, we're not saying they're bad. Like in Dickens, that's one of the things about Dickens. Dickens doesn't think that wealth is bad. He just thinks that, like, remember what Fred said in the film? He said, Scrooge has all this money, but he doesn't do anything good with it. The purpose of money is to do good things, right? That's what Dickens wants us to see. So, because Scrooge is so obsessed with this apparent good of money, and he's not ordered to the higher level goods. So remember, money is level 1, happiness. But it's really funny because what Scrooge does is normally, like, level 1 is pleasure seeking, right? And normally money's on level 1 because we want money to buy cool things. But Scrooge doesn't use his money for pleasure. It's the strangest thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, for Scrooge, money, I guess it's level 2 because it's all about, kind of like, it's not so much about status. It's really weird. It's just like it becomes an idol. I don't even know. It's strange. That's what his fiance said, right? Yeah, this is an idol, your master passion. And he doesn't take pleasure in it. And that's where, if you wanted to bring in virtue and vice, he suffers from the vice of insensitivity. So the vice of insensitivity, it's a lack of, it's the virtue of temperance orders our passions for things that give us pleasure. Insensitivity is when you can't take pleasure in things. So Scrooge is this deeply unhappy man who has all this wealth, but he doesn't even enjoy it. And that's where we had that quote from Fred where he said, it's in the other notes, but he said basically, he basically said that Scrooge doesn't do any good with his money. And when you're talking, like, if you give an example up here, so if you're talking about, you give, and you don't have to give all these examples, you could just do one. So you say, before Scrooge is selfish. For example, he rises the price of corn. You could bring in your more, remember your unit 4 vocab, that's the moral object. What did he do? He raised the price of corn. What was his intention? His intention was to make himself more money. What was the circumstance? He doesn't have to do it. It's going to hurt the poor. So you can, like, also evaluate that as, like, a moral act. So we see that part of Scrooge's character in the beginning of the film, it's deformed because he's not really living a fully flourishing human life. Because that's what, remember eudaimonia. Eudaimonia means to be, it means flourishing. And it gets translated as happiness, but it means to be a human person fully alive, as Jesus says in the Gospels. And obviously we could see that Scrooge isn't happy. He's not flourishing. And that's part of the reason why he does so many bad things. There's like a connection between doing bad things and being an unhappy person. So what happens after his interaction with the spirits? How does he change? Yeah.
Well, he's no longer, as inclined to be lonely as he accepts his nephew's invitation, like goes to meet his wife. And then later at the end it says he spends time with Tiny Tim and becomes like a second father to him.
Yeah.
So I'd say those are like two different places where he takes the negative of him being lonely and shutting people out and flips it.
Good, right. So he goes from being lonely to we could say being in relationship. And so you had a couple of different examples there. He goes to meet with Fred and his wife. And they had mentioned that it made them happy. And so he's able to share, now that he's in relationship, he's not just making himself happy, he's making others happy. So that's level 3. And that's where, like, you start getting really a deeper sense of satisfaction in what you're doing. He also, like you said, he starts a relationship with Tiny Tim and becomes his second father. And through that relationship, he's able to basically, like, save Tim's life. He's able to provide the financial support, I guess, to get the medical care the kid needed to thrive. Yeah.
Is there a way that a human being can live a happy life if they have money and they also spend some of it on charity and some of it?
Yeah, that's the ideal. Yeah, that's the ideal. The ideal is to balance, because virtue is to have a balance, and that's ideally what you want to do. So Scrooge, that's another way he changes. He starts sharing his wealth. He shared it with the philanthropist. He shared it with the philanthropist. He said he paid even more back. So he's giving over and above what he has to. Morally, I don't think he's really obligated to do that. I guess we could argue whether or not he's morally obligated to do that. But now the idea is you don't have to give all your wealth away. You don't have to live like nuns and priests and stuff like that. The idea is to have a balance. He gives to the philanthropist. He enjoys the music and the punch at the party that he goes to. So now he's able, before he didn't even have level 1 pleasure. That's how depraved this man was. Now he can enjoy those simple level 1 pleasures, and we're supposed to enjoy those things. Like as Catholics, there's a quote that says something like, every place that the Catholic sun doth shine, there is good food and music and wine. As Catholics, we're not puritanical. We should enjoy the goods of the earth. We got to do everything in moderation. So he gave to the philanthropists, also to the Cratchits. And you could actually compare that as a moral act, if you want, because you want to bring in some of that Unit 4 vocab, the moral act of giving, and that's also the level 3. Remember level 3 with you guys really did a good job with that. Level 3, the contributive level, and that's a sense of satisfaction that's going to stay with him. It's abiding. Yeah.
Well, also he tips the boy above
Mm-hmm.
and beyond,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not for example, the Cratchits he works with, or the philanthropist, they know him and they'll praise him.
Yeah.
And the boy is
Yeah, right.
someone, and same thing with the singers.
Yeah.
Just passes by.
Yeah.
Not involved in his life.
Yeah, and he takes joy in it. He's finally happy. Yeah.
Well, I think after he saw him not being appreciated, after when he was gone, when his things were just
Yeah.
taken away, when he was just seen as a valueless person, he was in such disbelief of that can't be me. That's not me.
Yeah.
Things I'm valued. He's no, you're not. According to everyone else and everyone else, he's seen tonight. It's you've seen people oh, your poor uncle. He's just not loving. He's not kind. And even Mrs. Cratchit was just wanted to curse him and wanted to be oh, I hate that man. And then Bob was well, he gave us a dinner.
Yeah.
At least we can
Yeah.
And I think seeing that and seeing
Good.
the weird children of ignorance.
Yeah.
That was weird.
Yeah.
I think, and for him, I think he got scared.
Yeah.
By being scared, I think that puts you in a different lens of how he was going to be his life. He saw, oh, I only have one life to live.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to die shortly.
Yeah.
Next Christmas, Tim will be gone.
Yeah.
For the kids, and now I think he needs to make major life changes, which he's done.
Yeah.
In order to fulfill, to be a moral person, to love others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's one of the themes in the film is before, because the one ghost, she keeps saying that she's the light of truth. He wants to remain ignorant of, like you said, his true nature, but through the kind of magical interaction with the ghosts, like you said, he sees who he really is, and he realizes, thankfully he doesn't want to be that way. And you could bring in the idea of human dignity. He didn't treat others with human dignity. And we can see how that by doing so, he robs himself of the dignity and value he ought to have. He doesn't even value himself. It's kind of crazy, but yeah, good. Yeah, so he sees the truth of human dignity and value. He saw what his nature was. It scares him. And that motivates him to change. Motivates him to change, and that's and that's a very Christian idea that Christians always have hope that we can change. Even somebody as incorrigible as Scrooge. It's like Aristotle, he would say, can't change. I'm not going to change. But he did. He did. Yeah.
Also reminds me of the story, is it Saul, the one who gets blinded?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where he was like an atheist, he hated God, and then he was scared when he got blinded, and then he changed his views to
Yeah, yeah.
God. But because I think whenever I was in a moment of I was scared and God was with me, or it was like a turning point. It's always, I feel like fear is a turning point to see the other side, and to see if you don't start acting this way, these are going to be your.
Yeah, and that's kind of a uniquely human thing too. The fact that emotion is important. We don't deny our emotions. Like, that was one of the problems with like Kant. He wanted morality to be based just on reason alone, and that's not what humans are. We're not just like little computers. And Scrooge was very emotionless in the beginning, and then through the powerful emotion of fear, as you said, that leads him to be able to go to even better emotions like love and generosity and tenderness. Yeah.
I think his comment on the surplus population, and then when the
yes, yeah.
This is the surplus population that you're wishing to die.
Yeah.
He kind of starts realizing that especially with human dignity, is human, and then again when he saw the father and mother of the two kids under the overpass, he realized that the poor, the poor and downtrodden, are still humans. They still want the best for their family.
Yeah.
They value that human connection and more than going to the workhouses. Because he said there's institutions, but then he's kind of realizing that these institutions aren't helping; they're harming the people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think he also sees the role he plays in creating a social structure where, rather than caring for the poor, we essentially were putting them in prison in Victorian England. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we got a lot of good ideas for these questions, and this one, I think, in a certain sense, this one is one of it's. I think it's pretty easy. It's just what you're gonna want to do. Remember, you get to bring these notes. All these pages. So, and if you messed up your notes and you want to rewrite them, you have to have them handwritten. I have a few extra copies, or you could just print it. It's on Schoology and get your notes ready for the final. Yeah.
Is it okay if we just use blank paper?
Yeah, that's fine too. Just no more than 4 pages. Because this is 4 pages, right? So. Let's look at the other questions. So question 5 was, hang on, let me get out of this. So question 5 is discuss the view of hardship and suffering. Let's put that here. Discuss the view of hardship and suffering in their relationship to human happiness as presented in A Christmas Carol. So for this one, let's see. For this question, the first thing, I guess you could either start with suffering and hardship or start with happiness. But, and we've covered some of this stuff in the previous question. So happiness, in what does it mean to be happy from the perspective of Catholic ethics? Happiness is grounded in our human nature. And we also learned about the levels of happiness. And so remember, level 1 was pleasure. I don't remember the Latin titles. So level 1 is pleasure, and it's about seeking pleasurable experiences, like consumerism, good food, like things like buying stuff, good food, I guess exercise, if you're things like that. And remember, with the levels of happiness, it's not like we're saying level 1 is bad and level 3 is good. The pleasures of level 1 are good things. The problem with level 1 is it's very short term. So, for example, an example would be, the pleasure from eating like the tiramisu cake. It's really good while you eat it, but how long does that, like an hour, that satisfaction, and then then you have like a sugar crash or whatever. Level 2 is achievement, and achievement is it's comparative, being better than others. Or it could also be yourself, like when you're in track and you're trying to PR all the time. This is more satisfying than level 1, but it can lead to jealousy and insecurity. And we actually saw that with Scrooge in when he was worried about having the money to get married. He's so worried that he needs this money. He puts the money before the relationship. Yeah.
So will level 1 also be like related to the human condition, where it's like we want one thing, and once we get it, we want another thing?
Yeah, that's actually what it leads to. It leads to and it's short term, and it's it leads to like that grasping. Yeah, because it's always it's very unfulfilling long term. Short term, it's good, and we need those things. Like Scrooge, we can add an example from the Scrooge. Scrooge, because he has the vice of insensitivity, he can't enjoy level 1 pleasure. Examples: Fred's party, or remember Fezziwig? Fezziwig, he was a cool guy. He threw that beautiful little party for his employees, and he was like living the good life. He did a good thing for his employees. They're enjoying the party. He has his wife and his friends. Like, that's the good life, right? And he wasn't going overboard. Like, remember, Scrooge is like, he didn't spend that much money. Like, that's like virtue right there. That's virtue. Then level 3 is contributive. And this is where you give for others. You live for something greater than yourself. And so we see that the philanthropists, they said that those who have means should provide for the poor. Jesus says that in the Gospel of Luke too. He says, to those to whom more is given, more is expected. And at first Scrooge, he's miserly, but eventually Scrooge actually starts doing that, and that's what actually brings him happiness, right? He's not happy. So Scrooge wasn't happy with the apparent good of hoarding wealth. It was only when he shares it that he becomes happy. So, and then finally, level 4, this is the one, it's the transcendent. This is level 4 is being tapped into. Typically, it's like being having a relationship with God, or it could be the idea that you're serving perfect truth, beauty, goodness, justice, love. So we see that in the Cratchits. That, you know, their faith is like the foundation of their hope. And they're not really in your face about it. Dickens is not in your face about it. We see them reading the Bible. We know they go to church. And the fact that the fact that they're not in your face about their faith shows you how deeply connected to God they are. They don't have to prove it to anybody. And we saw that when Bob Cratchit, so Timmy had died, but the family was still happy because they have the hope that they'll meet Timmy again and that Timmy is still alive in their love. So when we look at the question, it says, discover the view of hardship and suffering in relation to human happiness in the Christmas Carol. So what we see in A Christmas Carol is that when the characters are tapped into higher levels of happiness, they're able to endure suffering to a greater extent. And a great example of that is like the Cratchits. Their family, like when Timmy died, their family could have completely fallen apart. That happens a lot, right? But because they have level 3, because they have the love between the family members, and level 4 because they have the strength of their faith, they're able to endure the greatest suffering I think anyone can experience, like the loss of a child. Even the poor family, Nora was mentioning them. They had great suffering, but they wanted to stay together, and Scrooge's like attitude toward them was so callous. And his, even like when he said like, just send him to the workhouse, and the ghost is like, you don't even know what those places are like. And it's only when Scrooge has to face the truth and the reality of what a world looks like when you live the way he does, what it does to other people, that it kind of melts his heart and he's able to change. And it's through seeing that suffering that he's able to then give to the poor, get in relationship with his nephew, and he's able to actually make this changes in society that can alleviate some of the suffering that his business practices caused. Yeah.
Would him like not wanting to see the ignorance and wand thing, like children, like be like, I kind of mentioned it like slightly earlier. But
Yeah.
Him, like not wanting to see the truth, like him wanting to, like it's because he doesn't see it. It's not his problem anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the idea of truth, and that's a Unit 1 concept. That Scrooge wants to remain ignorant, so that he doesn't have to face responsibility for his part in creating structures of sin. He doesn't have to feel guilty for not giving to the poor, and like you said, he doesn't. It's not my problem. Remember, he said that to the philanthropist. He's like, I pay my taxes. There's workhouses, and that's part of human nature. Yeah, we pay our taxes, and that's good. But because Scrooge has more is expected of him. He doesn't have to give all of his money away, but he's not doing enough. and the ghost convict him of that. There could be other ways you could go with this one, but I think that's kind of what I was thinking. We'll see. I'll record this in other classes as well, and we'll see if we come up with other ideas. And the last question, it kind of relates to the one we were just doing. The last question is about the notion of human responsibility for the less fortunate in A Christmas Carol. So, let me get this so big. So for this one, I guess the first thing to say is, in terms of responsibility, responsibility is grounded in our human nature. And again, that's the kind of, that all Catholic, the sort of Catholic ethics is, we're always going to go back to human nature. So we're responsible because we're free. So we have free will, and that makes us responsible. And so it makes us responsible for our actions. And so in A Christmas Carol, we get to see kind of the story of Scrooge, as you guys have been saying, learning about the degree to which he's responsible for loving his neighbor, right? So if we just think of like the golden rule, or the idea of love thy neighbor, and we ask ourselves, does Scrooge take responsibility to love his neighbor? And we would say initially no. And you know, he when he talks to the philanthropist, he says that there are workhouses, I pay my taxes, which is good. I mean, that's one thing about Scrooge. He commits, like, a lot of his sins are sins of omission. Like, there's no indication that he's, like, cheating on his taxes or anything like that. So that's good. And then he says, of course, that horrible line where he says, let them die then and decrease the surplus population. Like, who says things like that? And so, what we see in the film is, as you guys have already pointed out, first we had this scene. So we had the philanthropist. And you can look at that scene, and you could kind of actually bring in the moral act there and evaluate the degree to which Scrooge should have helped the philanthropists. There was also with the ghost of Christmas present, he convicts Scrooge on two accounts. He said that that he made Scrooge see that Timmy is the surplus that Scrooge was so callous about. And so with Timmy, for whatever reason, Scrooge has a soft spot for Timmy, and or Tim, whatever his name was, and he is the surplus population. So that kind of put the human face on the problem of poverty for Scrooge. I got caps lock there somehow. And so, as you guys had already said this, that kind of facing that reality allows him to kind of see his responsibility. And then there was the scene with the poor family, and as you guys said, also the ignorance and want. and the ghost said that they are mankind's children. That whenever we fail to love neighbor, like we ought to, we are, we're creating, it was his ignorance, right? His ignorance was what led him to do the bad business practices, to fail to give to charity. And once he faces the reality that, I that poem, the one, what was it, by John Donne or something like that? No man is an island. Do you guys know that one? How much time? We have 10 minutes, right? Let's pop this in here. It's great. If you're not, no. Let's look at this. Let's pop this into our notes, because if you're not familiar with it, you're missing out. You could bring in prior knowledge, like what you learned about Jesus' teachings on this stuff in the Gospels as well, from freshman and sophomore year. But this poem, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is less. As well as you could read the whole thing. But the idea here is that part of human nature is that we are meant to be in community and we need each other. And in the story of A Christmas Carol is the story of how Scrooge has to learn. He has to become. It's almost like he has to become a human being. Like he has to learn that he is in relationship with the poor. That he needs to be in relationship with his sister's son. That he needs to have a relationship with his employee, where he doesn't just treat his employee like a servant, but treats him like a man and a father. And so, for this question, you can kind of look at that idea of Scrooge learning about like that idea that as rational moral agents, we're responsible for our actions, and our actions affect other people, right? And Scrooge has to learn that, and he does learn it, and he redeems himself, and he makes the changes that are necessary to kind of alleviate some of the suffering that he's caused, kind of directly and indirectly through either his lack of loving or his lack of contributing to charity, his unjust business practices. So for this one, you could bring in like those ideas. Does that make sense? And there are other ways you could attack these questions as well. You might be studying and think of other things. And as I review with the other classes today, I'll keep adding stuff to this document. So when you go home tonight, you'll look at the document again, and you'll see more things added to it. And for your final, what you're going to want to do is get your notes. So, have notes so you only really need 3 things. You need, because remember, 1, 2, and 4 are essentially the same. So, have some examples. When you use your word, when you use your terms, please define them, because if you don't define them, I don't know if you know what they mean, unless it's super obvious from the way you use it. But kind of know the key terms you want to use, know your examples, and you don't have to give, for example, like we had a bunch of examples up here. So how does Scrooge change? If you wanted just to focus on from being selfish to generous, that's fine. It's better to be focused and do a really good job on a focused example that clearly applies the vocabulary than giving a litany of examples that you don't really flesh out. Does that make sense? And I changed the rubric where it says like for an A gives one really good example. That way, if you look at the rubric when you're studying, because I think last year it said you needed multiple examples, and I think it messed up people's papers. I'm really excited to read these, because basically you've learned all the principles of Catholic morality, and now you get to apply them to the case study, because that's how Catholic morality works. It's not like Kant, where you just have these categorical imperatives. And it's not like utilitarianism where you only look at the consequences. We have these eternal principles, like human beings have value, like love your neighbor. And then the challenge of Catholic morality is, how do I live that out in each situation I encounter in my daily life? Yeah.
How long should it be again?
There's an outline that says like 6 paragraphs. It doesn't necessarily have to be 6. You should have an introduction and a conclusion, and you have to make sure you address the relevant topics from each of the 4 units. You don't necessarily have to say this is from unit 1. If it helps you, like if you need to see that to kind of like check it off, you can do it. I know what unit stuff comes from. As we continue today, I'll try to make sure it says, so when you're coming up with your notes, that's why I put this stuff with the vocab. Like, you're not going to use all this vocab, but maybe like for unit 2, you're going to define like human nature, and you're going to talk about like, I don't know, the hierarchy of goods, like just so you know what you're going to use from each unit. Does that make sense? I never know if what I say makes sense. It makes sense to me, but this is like, my mind is like there's like a hamster in there, and it just keeps running, and it won't slow down, and sometimes it falls off the track, and oh my gosh.
The hamster might need a break.
Huh?
The hamster might need a break.
Yeah. Well, so that's the problem. The hamster never slows down. I have ADD, so it's like, I don't know. Maybe I should take medicine for that. I don't know. All right. Is it time to go?
It's kind of just about using different things for each unit.
Yeah. You're just applying the terms that you've learned in the semester to a Christmas Carol. Yeah.
I thought it was like this part, like writing part,
Mm-mm. No, because you wouldn't have enough time to do both.
That's
Right?
But you'd be surprised the teachers are like, you should do.
Well, see, but that's an AP class. That's different. I have to teach to everybody, right? I